So are Joanne and Clifton, they're over there as well. So we got the teens up here with us this morning. And I know the Galloways, they're off on their trip, so we need to keep them in our prayers as well. Of course, Miss Sherry, she's still in the hospital, but seems like she's doing pretty well after her surgery. They moved her to a regular room, and so that's very good. So we're going to keep praying for her as well. But as we get started this morning, let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer in just a minute. Is there anyone else that we need to? Microphone not on? Am I on now? Still no? Yes, Sean Dillard. I wasn't turned on. That'll make sense. All right. Okay, so Kimbrell's daughter-in-law, right? Okay, she's having her last treatment. Of course, Sean Dillard, he's still going back and forth with doctors, trying to figure out the best course of treatment for him as well. All right, let's go ahead and start this morning with prayer. Father in heaven, we're so thankful unto Thee again for the day that Thou hast blessed us with, and the opportunity that we have to come and study from Thy Word. Father, we're so thankful unto Thee for all Thy many blessings. Father, we want to take time to lift up some of those of our number who are going through various ailments. Father, with Miss Sherry Edwards, as she's continuing to recover from her surgery, Father, Thou will continue to be with her, give her strength, that her recovery will be swift, and that everything will go the way that it needs to go. Father, with the Kimbrell's daughter-in-law, she's going through her last treatments, Father, that she'll continue to have strength as she goes through these treatments, and that those treatments will be able to work well, be able to help her. Father, continue to be with Sean Dillard as he's still trying to figure out the best course of action for himself, Father, that they'll be able to figure out what they need to do to be able to get him back to a better portion of his health, Father. Father, we're so thankful again for all Thy many blessings, for Thy love for us. And Father, we're just so thankful that we have this opportunity to meet and study from Thy Word. Father, we're thankful for Christ, You sent to die in our stead. And through His name we pray. Amen. All right, so we're in Jeremiah chapter 2. I'd like for us to go back over verse number 10 one more time, just because we were kind of rushed at the end of last week, and so I'd like for us to go over those two places one more time, because there might have been someone who wanted to know a little bit more about those two, and I know I rushed very quickly through those. So let's look again at Jeremiah chapter 2. And verse number 10, notice what's said here, "For pass over the isles of Kittim, and see, and send unto Kedar, and consider diligently, and see if there be such a thing." So remember what God, through Jeremiah, is telling Judah to do. He's saying, you look out to Kittim, which was out there to the west. You look out towards Kedar, out there to the east. So look to the west, look to the east. Is anyone doing the evils that you're doing, Judah? And the answer was no. Judah had left their God and gone after other gods. Not even pagan nations would do that. They had their idols, but they wouldn't just simply leave their idols. You had to come and conquer them, take them for you to get rid of their idols. So not even pagan nations with their idols would do what Judah did in leaving their God. But he says, look over the isles of Kittim. And so Kittim, if you have something that's a little bit more modern in your translation, it might say Cyprus. And that's exactly what Kittim is. It is the Isle of Cyprus there. And Cyprus is an island over in the Mediterranean Sea. But with it, it's had a long, long history. Cyprus was actually first ruled by Greece. And then whenever Assyria was coming in, they came in and they took over Cyprus. And then when the Roman Empire came up, they actually took Cyprus completely and made it part of the Roman Empire. But these people, they can actually trace their roots all the way back to Noah's son Japheth. You can look at Genesis 10, verses 2 through 5, and you can see where the people of Cyprus actually came from Noah's son Japheth. It's also mentioned in other prophecies. It's mentioned in Ezekiel 27 and verse 6. Isaiah mentions it, Isaiah 23, verses 1 and 12. And also Daniel. Daniel mentions Cyprus or Kittim, Daniel 11 and verse 30. And Kittim It's actually used in those intertestamental writings. You had the Old Testament, then you had about 400 years where we didn't have anything written for Scripture until you got to the New Testament. And so in those 400 years of what we call the intertestament period, the time between the Testaments, you had some people who wrote about it as well. First Maccabees is a history book. It's not an inspired book like First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles, but it is a history, and it calls Kittim the land of Alexander the Great, in First Maccabees 1:1 and also 8:5. And even the Dead Sea Scrolls mention Kittim, which is interesting because what the Dead Sea Scrolls talk about with Kittim is how the defeat of the people there, the Romans, actually came about at the hands of God's people. And last week we talked a little bit about what really brought down the Roman Empire was Christianity. It literally took it down from the inside out with those people there. But so you got Kittim. So he says, look to Kittim, look at that nation and those people. But then he also says, look at Kedar. And Kedar is down south and east over here in Arabia, as we call that. And so there's Kedar there in Arabia. So this is south and east of Judah. So he says, look out to the nations of the east, the Arabian people, and look at them. And what Kedar literally means is mighty. Okay, so they're a mighty people. It also means dusky or black. And that can be in reference to their skin or also their tents, because they were a people who dwelt in tents, and we'll see that in just a second. But Kedar, interesting, he was the second son of Ishmael. Okay, Genesis 25:13 and also 1 Chronicles 1:29. So he was the second son of Ishmael. And then later uses of Kedar is to the actual tribe that took the name of Kedar. So you had Kedar, the son of Ishmael, and then this tribe came from him, and so we call them the Kedarites, the people of Kedar. And some things about them is we just mentioned they occupied the area south and east of Palestine, east of Egypt, and that's Genesis 25:18 is where we learn where they came from. They're also described as being a nomadic people. They lived in tents. Psalm 120, verse 5, and also the Song of Solomon in chapter 1, verse 5 of that book also mentions them as living in tents. So they were a nomadic tribe who traveled around to different places. And of course, living in the desert, you can't really stay in one place for too long. You had to keep moving to find water and things like that. So they were a nomadic people. But they were led by princes, Ezekiel 27:21, and they were actually famous for their warriors. Specifically, they were famous for their archers, Isaiah 21, verse 17. So they were a mighty people, they were a strong people, and were renowned for their archers. But they were a people of some importance because of Isaiah 21:16 talks about how they were an important nation. They were one of the top nations during the time of Isaiah. So again, this is a very important people that God is mentioning here, but remember what he's doing. He's saying, look to the east, look to the west, look at all these different peoples. Okay, so these two are kind of references for the whole groups to the east and west. Has anyone done what Judah has done in leaving God? And the answer was no. No one had even come close to what Judah had done, and they had not just forsaken idols, they had actually forsaken the living God, which was an even greater crime in doing that. So you've got that there in verse 10, but then notice what happens in verse 11. Hath a nation changed their gods, which are yet no gods? But my people have changed their glory for that which doth not profit. So notice, continuing from verse 10 into verse 11, God continues and says, even the pagan nations are so devoted to their idols, they wouldn't even think about changing them. They wouldn't even think about getting rid of their idols to go after some other gods. They wanted theirs. And yet he says his people had left him. And they didn't just leave idols, they left the living God and actually went after idols, those things that do not profit. So notice the comparison there. The pagan nations, they're not going to leave their gods, but Judah had done what those nations would not even dare to do in abandoning their God. They had changed actual glory. He says they changed their glory, referencing to God there, for that which was without any profit at all. See, they had abandoned God for something that wasn't God. They had abandoned him for idols. And let's look just for a minute at how bad idols really are, about how ludicrous, about how crazy it is to actually follow idols. Go over with me to Isaiah 44. Look at Isaiah 44, and let's read just how strange it is for someone to worship something like an idol. Isaiah chapter 44. Starting in verse number 9, listen to Isaiah describe the people who go after idols. Isaiah 44, starting in verse 9. They that make a graven image, an idol, are all of them vanity, literally emptiness, and their delectable things shall not profit. And they are their own witnesses, they see not, nor know, that they may be ashamed. So whenever you've got an idol, notice what Isaiah says. He says they don't see anything, they don't know anything, they don't even know if you do something to them, if you make them ashamed, so why follow them? There's no purpose in one of these idols. Look at verse 10. Who hath formed a god, or molten a graven image that is profitable for nothing? Behold, all his fellows shall be ashamed, and the workmen, they are of men. Let them all be gathered together, let them stand up, yet they shall fear, and they shall be ashamed together. The smith with the tongs both worketh in the coals, and fashioneth it with hammers, and worketh it with the strength of his arms. Yea, he is hungry, and his strength faileth. He drinketh no water, and is faint. So you've got this image of the person who's working in the forge, hammering out this idol, and he's getting hungry, he's getting weak, he's getting thirsty from working on this idol, and this idol is going to profit nothing anyway. So why is he working on it? Verse 13, the carpenter, he stretcheth out his rule, his measuring rod there. He marketh it out with a line. He fitteth it with planes, and he marketh it out with the compass, and maketh it after the figure of a man. So notice an idol is after the figure of a man there, according to the beauty of a man, that it may remain in the house. Verse 14, he heweth him down cedars, great large trees, and taketh the cypress and the oak, which he strengtheneth for himself among the trees of the forest. He planteth an ash, and the rain doth nourish it. Then shall it be for a man to burn, for he will take thereof and warm himself. So notice what's going here, verse 14. He's saying they're actually going to take trees and actually plant trees to grow them just so they can make an idol out of them. But not only that, they also use those to burn, to warm themselves with. And he kindles it, again in verse 15, and bakes bread with it. Yea, he maketh a god and worshipeth it. He maketh it a graven image and falleth down thereto. But look at verse 16. He burneth part thereof in the fire. With part thereof he eateth flesh. He cooks, he roasteth roast, and is satisfied. Yea, he warmeth himself, and saith, Aha, I am warm, I have seen the fire. But verse 17, and the residue thereof he maketh a god, even his graven image. He falleth down unto it, and worshipeth it, and prayeth unto it, and saith, Deliver me, for thou art my God. So notice what this person has done. He's actually gone and grown himself some trees that he's going to use not only to kindle fire and things like that, but he actually takes those trees and he cuts them down. He takes part of that tree, throws it into the fire to warm himself and to cook his food, and then with the other part of the tree, he makes a god and bows down to it. The same thing that he threw into the fire to cook his food is what he's going to worship. You see how ridiculous that is? How insane that mindset is? You're taking something that you've used to cook food, and now you're going to worship it. That'd be like us today taking our ovens and baking a meal in it and then bowing down to it and worshiping it. That's basically what they were doing with this. But they worship these idol gods. Notice again, Isaiah, he does a lot with idols. Look at chapter 46 of Isaiah. One more time, look at how ridiculous these idols are. Isaiah 46. Look at verse number 5 here. To whom will ye liken me, says God, and make me equal and compare me that we may be like? They lavish gold out of the bag, and weigh silver in the balance, and hire a goldsmith, and he maketh it a god. They fall down, yea, they worship. They bear him upon the shoulder. They carry him and set him in his place, and he standeth. From his place shall he not remove. Yea, one shall cry unto him, yet can he not answer, nor save him out of his trouble. So notice there, these idols, they would take these things like gold and silver, and they would weigh them out in the balance, take it to the goldsmith, and he would actually make you an idol out of it. And then this idol was so worthless and useless, they'd actually have to pick that idol up, put it on their shoulder, carry where it was supposed to go, and then put it in its place. Why did they have to do that? Because the idol couldn't do that for himself. He couldn't get up and walk to the place he was supposed to go. It required man to actually pick him up and take him there. And then once he's there, he's going to stay there for as long as he's going to be. He's not going to get up and move somewhere else. Why? Because he's an idol. Okay, so you see how just ridiculous these idols are, that you would make it out of the thing you made your cooking fire with. You actually have to carry it around yourself and put it where it goes. And yet they won't leave those. And Judah left the living God. It's incredible to think about that comparison of the two. These pagan nations, they will not leave these ridiculous idol gods, and yet Judah left the living God. I like what Robert R. Taylor Jr. said. He said, they accepted a great big nothing for the sovereign of the universe. And that's exactly what they did. They took the sovereign of the universe, the creator of all things, and traded it for a great big nothing. That's what Judah had done, and God is condemning them for that, for leaving him and doing just that. So notice then verse number 12. It says, be astonished, O ye heavens, at this, and be horribly afraid. Be ye very desolate, saith the Lord. So notice, talking about them leaving God, he tells the heavens to be astonished, literally be appalled at this, to be horribly afraid, literally to be stilled with fear. Have you ever been so scared you couldn't move? That's what he's telling the heavens to be whenever they are looking at Judah forsaking God. Be so afraid that you're stilled with fear, and be desolate, literally very dry. So God calls the heavens themselves, along with all the people to the east and the west that we've already noticed, and tells them, look at Judah. Have you ever witnessed something like this? And the answer of the east and west, and also of the heavens above, would be no. We've never seen anything like this. This is absolutely crazy. It's insane that they would do such a thing. So he actually calls the heavens, the sky, into account here to look at Judah and to be afraid of what they are doing. Verse 13, for my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed them out cisterns, broken cisterns, that can hold no water. So notice here what Judah's done. They were not just content with one evil, they actually committed two evils. They forsook the God of the living waters, and they made them out broken cisterns that couldn't even hold water. So they did two evils. They rejected God, and then they replaced God with something irrelevant, something broken. So the comparison between the clean waters of an ever-flowing fountain from God, and then you've got this idea of a cistern, this stagnant, putrid pool of water in a broken cistern, is the comparison here. Who in their right mind would leave a beautiful flowing stream to drink from and then go and drink from a stagnant pool of water? Who would do that? You ever drunk from a stream running down from a mountainside? That's some of the best water I think I've ever had in the Appalachians. Go up there and you find a stream that's running through some limestone or something like that that purifies it, and you drink from that, and it's cold, it's refreshing, it's beautiful. But then I also used to have a pond out in the backyard that was about the most disgusting thing I've ever seen in my life, and I never wanted to drink from it. You see, I would never trade those mountain waters for that stagnant pool. That's exactly what Judah did. They traded that beautiful, clean, fresh water from God for a stagnant pool of idol worship. And when you think about it like that, you would think, how on earth could they do that? But then today, how many people, instead of being at the worship services on Sunday morning, would rather be out on the lake? Would rather be somewhere else doing something else? Are they not doing the same thing? Trading the living water of God for a stagnant pool of idol worship? I think that they are. See, but with Judah, the crazy thing about them is they didn't just accept a cistern, they accepted a broken cistern. They hewed them out cisterns, but broken cisterns. They didn't even want something whole and complete, they wanted something broken. So you think about it, who here would trade something that you had, for example, your car, your phone, whatever it is, that's completely whole and working perfectly, who would take that and trade it for something that doesn't work? It doesn't make sense. Well, that's exactly what Judah did when they left God and went after these idols. See, who would pay someone for a job, and then once that job was finished, you went out there to check their work and you saw that it was all broken and it wasn't complete? Would you still pay the person for that? I wouldn't. But Judah did. They had this idea that we're going to go after these idols, these broken cisterns, this thing not even finished, not even complete, and yet we're going to give money to it, we're going to worship it. And it's just crazy to think about how you can have that mindset. But this is exactly what Judah did when they abandoned God. See, they emptied themselves of God. And when you empty yourself of God, what do you have to do? You have to fill it with something else, don't you? You remember Jesus talking about the man who had the demon cast from him? And then what happened after that demon left? He went and found 7 more evil than himself, and they came back and they found the heart what? Cleaned out, swept, and ready for them to come right back. What's the meaning of that story? What's the purpose of that? You see, whenever you have the evil taken out of you, whenever you get rid of the sin in your life, and you don't fill it with God, you don't fill it with something good, you're allowing more evil to come back and fill that empty place that used to be there. See, so whenever we ask for forgiveness of our sins, whenever we have that cleansing from God, if we don't fill it with God, we don't fill it with His Word, we don't fill it with good things, we're just opening up the door for more evil to come in. That's the purpose of that idea that Jesus portrayed there. And that's exactly what Judah did. They had this emptiness, they had abandoned God, and they had this emptiness that they needed to have filled, and so they thought that they could fill it with idols. And yet, these idols were worthless. They didn't have any value to them. And so were they really filling that hole? No, they were filling it literally with emptiness. How can you fill an empty hole with emptiness? You can't do it. Well, that's exactly what Judah was trying to do. Notice verse 14. Is Israel a servant? Is he a homeborn slave? Why is he spoiled? Is Israel a servant? Is he a homeborn slave? Why is he spoiled? So notice here, was Israel, are you a servant? Were you purchased with money? No. Were you born into slavery, Israel? No. Israel was supposed to be God's own son who was loved for and cared by God. They weren't born into slavery. They weren't purchased with money into slavery. They were God's own children. So why then were they being spoiled? Why were they being punished then? Was it God's fault they were being punished? No, it wasn't God's fault. What was the cause of Israel and Judah's rebellion? Or rather, I just answered the question of their punishment. It was their rebellion, right? They rebelled against God and against His law. And so what was the obvious outcome from that? It was punishment. We've talked before about how God is a just God, and justice requires punishment for evil. It requires punishment for sin. If someone does something that's wrong, justice says they have to pay a price for that. You can't just have someone commit a crime and then just tell them, just don't do that again, and we're not going to do anything about it. That's not justice. Justice says there has to be punishment for a crime committed. And so for Judah and Israel, they committed a crime against God. And so what's the obvious outcome? A punishment. And that's going to come in the form of Assyria for the northern tribes, and then Babylon in just a little bit for the southern tribes. But verse 15, the young lions roared upon him and yelled, And they made his land waste. His cities are burned without inhabitant. So notice here that punishment has been inflicted on Israel. So we're talking about those northern tribes still. They were inflicted on Israel by young lions. Okay? So with this young lions, who were the ones who took down the northern tribes? It was Assyria, right? So these young lions are referencing to Assyria. And that's really interesting because if you go back and you look in history, lions were actually a royal symbol of Assyria. You go and look at their crests that they would have on shields and different things like that, and they would have this picture of, I believe it's Sennacherib, one of their greater kings, and what he was doing is actually hunting a lion with a spear. And they would take that royal lion hunt and they would emblazon it on things. And so whenever you thought about a lion then in this time, you thought about Assyria. Okay, because the picture of them was of a lion. But what about a young lion? Why a young lion? Well, whenever you've got something that's a little bit younger, they're usually a little bit more fearless, aren't they? A little bit more ferocious, a little bit more powerful than the old lions. You see, Assyria, they weren't an old lion. They were a young lion. A young, strong, powerful lion that was ready to take down Israel. And they did just that. This pictures the nature of the nation of Assyria, who was going to come down and take Israel and also try to take Judah. You remember the Assyrian nation, they conquered the northern tribes. That was no problem. But then they started to try and take Judah. And I believe we've mentioned this before as well. But what happened when Sennacherib and his army got to the gates of Jerusalem? You had those 185,000 Assyrians that woke up dead. Okay, so you had that in 2 Kings 19, 31 to 36. You had all this widespread destruction of Israel and Judah, but they got to the gates of Jerusalem and they couldn't take it because God intervened. So they went back home. But a lot of the cities of Judah also were burned, but the punishment was widespread. All of Israel, you were taken by this nation of young lions, these strong, powerful people, and that destruction was widespread. They were burned without inhabitants. Okay, so they were laid waste, the verse says. So Assyria came through and just completely wiped out Israel and tried to do the same with Judah. Notice verse 16 here. Also the children of Naph and Tahpanhes have broken the crown of thy head. So now we've got two more cities. Okay, so we talked about Kedar and Katim, but now we've got these two. These are actually two Egyptian cities. Okay, so Naph, it was over on the Nile River here. Let's see. There it is. Oops, I lost it. Losing my eyesight. Oh, there we go. All right, so you had Naph. This was Memphis on the actual Nile River, and what Naph means is the abode of the good one. This used to be the ancient capital of Egypt. It was located south of modern-day Cairo. It was on the west bank of the Nile River. Naph, or Memphis, was actually founded by Menes, a pharaoh of the first dynasty. That's about 2800 BC. And it became the capital of Egypt in the third dynasty. That's about 2686 BC. But Memphis actually remained the capital for about 300 years, but then it was kind of taken over by some of these other cities like Thebes there and some of these other cities that took place. But with this, Memphis, it remained the capital under people like the Hyksos, some people from the north that took over. But there's little that remains of Memphis today. The ruins of Memphis were actually torn down by the Muslims whenever they were building Cairo. So you had the Muslim people come in, they found the ruins of Memphis, they destroyed them, and they actually started to build the city of Cairo, Egypt on top of it. But the largest structure in that city was the Temple of Ptah. And so this was a large, immaculate temple that once stood there. But they actually took that temple and they tore it down, and they used it for building materials for the building of Cairo. And so they kind of had a disrespect for the history that was there as they tore down the ruins of Memphis or Noth there. But then you also had this other one, Tahapanes, or Daphne, was this other Egyptian city. And it's actually up here in the Nile Delta, in that green part there. But what it was, this idea here is actually a Hebrew transliteration. So they took the Egyptian name and just turned it into Hebrew letters there. Literally what it means is the fortress of Pinhas, or the house of Nubian. Now, like I said, it was located on the Nile Delta, over there on the eastern border of Egypt. The current site had very little occupation before 663 BC, where it was used to garrison Greek troops against Assyria. But in 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar actually defeated the Egyptians at what was called Carchemish, and Carchemish was actually way up here. Okay, so there's Carchemish there on the river. But Nebuchadnezzar actually defeated the Egyptians here, and what they did after they defeated the Egyptians at Carchemish is they chased them down through Israel, through Judah, and chased them back to the border here at Daphne. And right there, the Egyptians with Necho, they actually had a stalemate there, so they couldn't get into Egypt. Egypt kept holding them off. But after the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, you remember we talked about this in the introduction. The Jews, after they destroyed Judah and everything like that, Babylon did, what did they try to do with Jeremiah? They tried to take him to Egypt with them. And so where they actually took him to was here at Tahapanes, or Daphne, Jeremiah 43:7, also 44:1. So this is actually the city where they were going to take Jeremiah. He argued against going, Jeremiah 42:19, and he warned that Nebuchadnezzar was going to come back there, Jeremiah 46:14. And so what these two cities represent then, you've got the north and a little bit of the south, but what they actually represent is Egypt as a whole. And so they represent all of Egypt in this prophecy here. And what they're talking about with that breaking of Judah's crown, you remember it says they have broken the crown of thy head. You remember which king of Judah died in battle with Egypt? It was their last good king. It was Josiah. Josiah died in battle with Pharaoh Necho, 2 Chronicles 35:20 through 27. And so that breaking the crown of thy head, likely that's a reference to when Josiah, their king, their crown, died in battle against Egypt there. Okay, but he says to look there at Egypt. Okay, so look at those people of Egypt. They've broken your head and things like that. But verse 17, hast thou not procured this unto thyself, and that thou hast forsaken the Lord thy God when he led thee by the way? So notice here, God's now going to give them the reason why all this punishment is coming. Remember, God never punishes someone or a nation or whatever it is without telling them why. Okay, he never does that. He always gives them the reason. And here's the reason for Judah. Have you not done this to yourself, he says, in that you have forsaken the Lord thy God? So the reason for all these problems, for this war in Egypt, for with Assyria, with Babylon, all these different things, what was the problem? It was they had forsaken God. Okay, God gives them the reason for all this punishment. God had taken care of them for so long, and yet they still left him. Okay, they just got up and they left him. So whenever we think about this, this is very interesting with God here. Who are going wrong in our lives? We know bad things are going to happen, but whenever we start to blame God for bad things that are happening in our lives, who really moved? Was it God or us? It was us. You see, God doesn't move. Whenever things start to go wrong in our lives, whenever we start to sin and we start to have the consequences of those sins upon us, it wasn't God that moved from us. We got up and left God and moved away from him. But the great thing is that God is always going to be in that same place. So if we would just come to ourselves, we repent of those sins, and we turn back to God, he's right there where he's always been, waiting for us to come back. And so it's not God that does the leaving. It's us. We're the ones who leave God, and this verse shows that. God didn't leave Judah and Israel. He was right there the whole time. They got up and they left him. Okay, but he's always there waiting for us to come back. Verse 18. And now what hast thou done, and now what hast thou to do in the way of Egypt to drink the waters of Sihor, or what hast thou to do in the way of Assyria to drink the waters of the river? So notice what they did here. Instead of trusting God, they had gone back and forth, swaying back and forth with allegiances with Egypt. Now we're going to go to Assyria. You know what? Egypt's looking pretty strong. Let's go back to them. Oh, wait, Assyria, they're looking pretty strong. Let's go back to Assyria. So they're swaying back and forth between Assyria and Egypt. And he says that they've drunk the waters of Sihor. That's the Nile River there flowing down. So he says you drunk from the rivers of the waters of the Nile, but he also says you drunk from the river, talking about Assyria. That would be the Euphrates River that flowed up there through Assyria. So he says you're drinking from these two rivers, you're going back and forth between them, but you're not trusting in God. So what they had done is they had been swaying back and forth between a broken reed. You go to 2 Kings 18:21, Isaiah 36:6, Ezekiel 29:6 and 7, where it talks about how Egypt's a broken reed. Literally what they're talking about is, here's Judah leaning on Egypt, and because Egypt is a broken reed, once they lean on them, the reed breaks and the reed goes through their hand. That's what Egypt was to Judah. They were more of a pain and a hindrance than an actual help. They were a broken reed that actually went through the hand. But they swayed between that and the broken cisterns we talked about of Assyria and her gods, Jeremiah 2:13. So you've got them swaying back and forth between these two nations, but really, would either nation really help them? No. What did they need? They needed God, the one who they could put their trust in, put their hope in. Like they had in the past, that was what they needed. But instead, they saw the power of Assyria, they saw the power of Egypt, and they said, that's where we're going to get our help. We don't need God, we just need one of these powerful nations. But those powerful nations weren't going to help them at all. So verse 19, thine own wickedness shall correct thee, and thy backsliding shall reprove thee. Know therefore, and see that it is an evil thing and bitter, that thou hast forsaken the Lord thy God, and that my fear is not in thee, saith the Lord God of hosts. So notice what's happening here now. They are paying the price for throwing away God. Okay, they didn't have that fear of God in them anymore. They had forsaken God. Therefore, their own wickedness, their own backsliding is what's going to reprove them. Okay, so they were paying the price for throwing God away. Jeremiah is revealing the cause of their punishment. They had continued in wickedness and backsliding. They had forsaken God, and these things would be their punishment. See, their choices to receive help from Assyria and Egypt, God never commanded them to do that. God wanted them to trust in Him, but whenever they went to go and trust in Egypt and Assyria, they were actually showing a lack of respect, a lack of trust in God. But all this would come and actually bring this destruction on Judah and Israel. See, forsaking the Lord, he says it's an evil thing and it's a bitter thing. Literally, it's an angry, discontented, great, or heavy thing whenever you forsake God. Someone read for us James 4:13-17. How bad is it to really forsake God, to leave Him out of your mindset? It's the same for us today. Whenever we do that, it's a bitter thing. It's an angry, disgruntled, heavy thing. James 4, but read verses 13-17.
Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell and make a profit.
All right, so notice here, we use that last verse, verse 17, for a variety of things, that if you know to do something good and you don't do it, then it's a sin, and that's got a broad picture there, kind of a universal approach there. But if we look at just those verses, starting with verse 13 and working your way forward, you've got these people who are saying that today or tomorrow we're going to go into the city, we're going to buy and sell and get gain. We got tomorrow. We don't have to worry about, we've got all next year. We don't have to worry about time. And then what James does is he says, but what's your life? It's just a vapor. It's here and then it's gone. You don't know if you have tomorrow. And he says that you're actually boasting. You've got this prideful attitude when you claim that, hey, I've still got tomorrow. Because you don't know if you have tomorrow. You really don't know if you have that next day or the next or next year. We actually don't know if we have that time. And then you get to verse 17, still in that same context, that him that knows to do good and doesn't do it, to him it is sin. What's that whole passage talking about right there? He's talking about keep God in your plans. Okay, you got to keep God in your plans. That's why a lot of times we'll say, Lord willing, we'll do this. Lord willing, we're going to do that. If the Lord wills, then this will happen in the future, whatever it might be. We say that because of this passage, because we want to make sure that we're in line with God's will. But what that verse 17 there is saying is if you have the prideful, boastful attitude of leaving God out of your plans and you just assume that you have the next day, assume that you have the next week, the next year, then that is sin to you because you're leaving God out of your plans. See, whenever you forsake God and you leave Him out of the picture, then you get to this evil thing, this bitter thing talked about here in Jeremiah. But leaving God out of your plans is an evil thing. Okay, it's a sin to do that. We've got to keep God in our plans and to know that we don't know if we have tomorrow. So we're going to trust in God and we're going to keep Him at the focus of everything that we have. But not only that, they also had no fear. They had no reverence of God. Someone read Romans 3:18 as we finish this morning. Romans 3 and verse 18. They had no fear, no reverence of God. Romans 3 and verse 18.
There is no fear of God before their eyes.
There's no fear of God before their eyes. Is that still a problem today? It's still a problem today. People talk about God. They talk about how you don't have to worship God. He's just going to save everyone, all these different things about God. You got atheists who go and they denounce God and things like that. And so what that is that that's a show that there's no fear, there's no reverence of God before their eyes. But the same thing was happening with Judah and Israel in the time of Jeremiah, that they were lacking this reverence, this fear of God. And today and throughout history, it's kind of always been that same thing. There's no fear of God before their eyes. And what happens when you lose that fear of God before your eyes? A lot of bad things start to happen. So we've got to remember, keep God at the forefront, have that fear, that reverential fear of God, and always keep God in our plans is what we need to do as Christians today. But thank you so much for your attention this morning.